Good day, Goodrich staff. I'm Cheryl Turner with the Center for Children, Families, and Law at the University of Nebraska. I had the opportunity to speak with you all in this past fall, looking at creating a trauma-sensitive school environment. Came in and provided some feedback on a basic trauma assessment I had completed in your school. Just a reminder that when I'm in the school, I am not looking at how you are teaching in terms of academics. That is not my area of expertise. I'll leave that to you all as the experts. More so what I'm really looking at is the environment itself. How does it support a student who is high stress, does not manage vulnerabilities well, maybe is impulsive, might even have a state of fear or just some kind of general chaos within their lives, and how does an individual like that manage in your middle school environment? So in the feedback session that I did this past fall, I kind of gave you 3 tasks to take with you and to look at, and how could you incorporate those into your classrooms? What might that look like in your school environment? And more importantly, just to start a conversation. Coming back this time, I was only at the school from about 10 to 1:30. Reason being is we were specifically looking at just those general 3 areas, and the majority of those really focus around major transitions. And when I talk major, we're talking before lunch, after lunch, to and from electives, things along that line. And so I just kind of really, my biggest focus was around those lunchtime transitions and what that time of day looked like, as that is when students tend to be most vulnerable. So what I'm going to do for you guys today via this recording is this is my second feedback session, having come back and spent some time back at the school, kind of what's changed, what's different, where do we go with the future. So I do have a basic PowerPoint to kind of go through with you briefly. I think it's always important to start with some positives. I think everybody needs to hear that. Just as I saw this past fall, I cannot emphasize enough that I truly do believe and observe that teachers and staff within the Goodrich Middle School environment really do have genuine care and concern for the students, and that is very evident in the interactions. I again got to see a lot of reteaching versus redirection. As we know, students who are high stress have a hard time with verbal redirections, because that stress often can result in kind of that tunnel vision and that inability to really hear those words. So that reteaching really brings that across in a much more positive way. Your staff continue to be very, very helpful beyond just, hey, do this, or this is what I need from you. Really getting in there and being involved in the process. Supervision levels are really high in major areas. And so major areas would be such as like outside during your lunch recess times or outside times, main classroom hallways. So the 6th grade hallway, the 7th grade hallways, the 8th grade hallway all appear to have a fairly high level of supervision during those significant transition times. And I did see that some of the classrooms throughout the school have added some transition to regulation building, which is what we talked about last time. So lots of positives. I shared with you several pages of positives last time when I spoke with you, and in order to protect your time and be respectful of that, I am going to leave it at that, but all of those positives are still relevant and still in play. Just a quick reminder for you, when we are talking trauma, what we're really talking about is stress and a stress response. Particularly, these are the kind of 6 biggest areas of the brain, or the connections in the brain, that are most impacted by that stress. Impulsivity is number 1 on that list. Kids with significant unresolved stress tend to be much more impulsive in general, have difficulties with regulating stress, regulating mood, have problem-solving concerns, particularly with peers, can be with adults as well. Short-term memory is often impacted, and then just empathy in general. Empathy is not something we're born with. We have to build that over time. If I'm raised in an environment that doesn't necessarily support that, I may really struggle with some of those empathetic pieces. So kind of your top 6 areas most impacted by that trauma and that stress. And ultimately, what triggers that reactive behavior, and again, reactive behavior can be external or internal. It can be that fight, flight, freeze response that's on the outside. It can just be an internal shutdown, isolation, withdrawal. Can kind of go either way. But these are your top 4 things that are going to trigger that. When you look at this list, all 4 of these things are present in adolescents' lives anyway. This is all part of just kind of normal and who they are. Including vulnerability. From the moment I step foot into an environment where I'm surrounded by peers, vulnerability is naturally created there. And I step foot in an environment in which adults are in charge, that lack of control is naturally a piece of life's process. Fear can be present. Stress in general, it's difficult to be a middle school student right now. It's difficult 30 years ago. It's difficult 60 years ago. It's just a hard age. And so we know that vulnerability, lack of control, and stress is a normal part of the everyday. So when we talk about those triggers, what I'm talking about is those kids who don't have the internal, the external skills, who don't have the healthy functioning support systems, or just the general resiliency to manage the emotions, the feelings, and the reactions that come with these natural pieces. Additionally, because of their misconceptions and their perceptions, which are often skewed, those vulnerabilities are much greater. That lack of control perception is much greater, and that stress then ultimately is much greater. So we do see a lot of pieces around trauma in our schools. Again, trauma is any event. It can be anything, but the important piece is the support systems that are in place, the coping pieces internally or externally that are in place, and ultimately just resilience. So I've had some people who have said, why? Why go through this process? Why put these things in place? Really, what does it benefit? And ultimately, when you, Cheryl Turner, when you come in here and you ask us to do these transitions, and you ask us to create safe spaces, and you ask us to have calming zones, really is all we're doing is just holding the hands of our students. And what I'm going to tell you is whether you see it as hand holding, or whether you see it as coddling, or whether you see it as actually a protective factor, in the end, what does it benefit? And I'm going to tell you right now, research, science, and exposure has told us it absolutely impacts learning. It absolutely impacts retention of information, and it absolutely impacts engagement. So however your perception is of this process at this time, I'm going to tell you that if you take the time to put these things in place, over a period of time, you're going to begin to see the benefit. It's not going to happen overnight. As we know, most things don't happen overnight. It will take some time for that to happen. So there's 6 specific points that I kind of want to look at when I have individuals who are saying, is it hand-holding or is it really increasing success? First and foremost, trauma is not an excuse. And I want to make sure that you all hear me on that. Trauma is not an excuse for behavior. And so if we were hand-holding, what we really would say is, well, you hit that kid, but I know you've been through X, Y, and Z, so this time we'll let it slide. That's hand-holding. Versus if I look at a kid and I say, I hear that you were upset and I hear that you were angry and you struck a peer. And that is not okay. Striking a peer is a non-negotiable, and it's not something that we allow in this school. Now, help me understand what was going on in that moment. Help me understand what was happening or what has happened that led up to this. Having a conversation with the other individual involved, what was happening, what led up to this. Let's address this. Now that we have addressed this, understand that hitting another student is a non-negotiable. As a result, the consequences for that action are A, B, and C. It doesn't change the consequences. It doesn't change the rules and the expectations. It doesn't change what is going to happen, but it changes how we approach it. Healing begins a moment a voice is heard, and that cannot be any truer than when our adolescent population is present. And so by allowing them an opportunity to say, hey, this is what was happening, this is what has happened, thanks for listening. Okay, yeah, no, I still have a consequence. Whether that is an in-house suspension, an out-of-school suspension, whether that's a referral home, whatever it may be, the consequence is still in place, but having a conversation around that helps us really understand and maybe change things for the future so it doesn't happen again. The other one, number 2 on my, and I have 6 total. So number 2, stress impacts the ability to learn. When we are in a high stress state, our brains don't function the same. We have a hard time hearing and processing verbal communication. When you think about in a classroom, how much of our instruction is verbal? How much of our expectations are verbal? How much of getting this work done and learning and processing is from a verbal process? Well, if I am in high stress, I can't hear those things. If you take 30 seconds to 2 minutes to bring my brain stress down, I can hear you. I can be a part of that learning process. Number 3, on average of the classrooms I observed, and I will tell you right now, I don't get to every single classroom because there's not 5 of me, but on average, when we look at high transition times, again, to lunch, from lunch, to your extracurricular, not extracurricular, I apologize, to your elective classes, back from elective classes, things along that line. On average, the classrooms I've observed that do not have transition processes in place are losing 5 to 7 minutes of instruction time. And that 5 to 7 minutes of instruction time is when you have had to indicate to the students 10 times, hey, this is what I need you to do. This should already be out. This is where we are. Why isn't it quiet? I need everybody in their seats. Let's get this done. Let's go, let's go, let's go. You're losing time by having to do this. Versus if I spend 2 minutes de-stressing, calming the brain, getting everybody on track, at the end of that 2 minutes, my students are up and ready to go. And I'm not having to continually redirect, and I'm not having to continually try and get everybody on the same page because everybody's already there. The classrooms that I did observe that have added some of these transition pieces in, and there were 2 in particular that I had previously timed and tallied, and one of those went from having 14 redirections over a 9-minute period to having 1 redirection in a 3-minute period. That is a significant shift in learning time. So is it hand-holding or is it increasing success? In that moment, it's increasing success. It's increasing the ability to learn, to understand, and to be involved. Number 4, teachers are frustrated and fatigued. This is something that is not just a school-wide concern. This is not something that is a district-wide concern. This is something that is a national concern. Teachers are becoming more and more fatigued and more tired earlier in the year, each year. This year, on average, we're seeing about October was our cutoff, in which we're already seeing that exhaustion begin. If I create a classroom that is less stress, if I create a culture in my classroom and in my learning environment that has a hard set of expectations, that has non-negotiables, that is based on relationships, not only are my students less frustrated and less fatigued, so am I as a teacher. And when I am less stressed and less fatigued, I am more impactful on my students. Relationships, they are the core to resilient learners. If anybody has had the opportunity to read or review the Fostering Resilient Learners book, it absolutely really does a nice job of outlining how important those relationships are. The times to build those relationships are during those transition times, during those most vulnerable points, and even through then just the general classroom environment. The last one I'm going to say, supervision. It creates safety while providing an opportunity for that relationship building, kind of coming back to number 5. So supervision in your main areas is very high, and I absolutely loved it. At no point in time did I feel super stressed or uncomfortable in main hallways. And so when I talk main hallway, I'm thinking like the 8th grade hallway, all the way down the set of classrooms. During those period changes and transition times, there are teachers that are outside of their classroom, and particularly by the end of that transition time, everybody's kind of out and about and involved in that. Same thing with the 6th grade hallway, same thing down with the 7th graders. The supervision is there. But Goodrich Middle School has a lot of hidden, I don't call them hidden hallways, or kind of those off areas where there maybe isn't as much eyes on that. And the amount of stuff that is going on that creates vulnerability, that creates stress in those key areas is huge. And I don't know if people are as aware because there's just not a presence there. It's not a problem. It's not because somebody's not doing their job. I think these are just natural areas within Goodrich where there's lost line of sight. And the best example I have, and this is where I really tried to locate myself, was in these specific areas. And there are two that I can really think of. Number one is between the 8th grade hallway and the 6th grade hallway. There is that corridor that would run, so it'd be horizontal to those two vertical hallways. And that little area, so for the 8th graders to walk out of their hallway, then they cut across, and then they come back up to go to like the cafeteria and those areas. That area has a ton going on during large transitions. There is name calling, there is kicking, hitting, pushing, punching, rudeness, disrespect, and just overall chaos in that small area. So why bring it up? Well, if I am a student who doesn't manage vulnerability and stress well, what am I going to do when it comes time to know that I've got to go through that area with all my peers? Well, if I'm in my 8th grade hallway or my 6th grade hallway and I act up enough and I cause enough problems and you have to keep me behind, then I don't have to go through that area because there isn't that supervision piece there. If there was somebody in that specific area, what a great opportunity for that individual, though they do lose out on that 4 or 5 minutes of planning time, and I get that piece, though they lose out on that opportunity to connect with all of the students coming through there, that opportunity to talk and discuss and to be a part of what's going on in that moment, as well as an adult eyes on what's happening. The other big hallway that I can think of is going to be the hallway that runs down to the gymnasiums. So you have that long hallway, there's a music room, and one other room, and then you have your 3 gyms that run along that. When students are transitioning and they're all coming down this hallway at once, it's kind of like the same things that you see in that smaller hallway between the 8th and 6th grade corridors. There's just a lot going on in that moment, and there's no adult supervision in that area. So the importance of teachers, no matter what your role is in the school, no matter what you're teaching, being amongst students in all areas creates that safety concept. So again, is this hand-holding or is it increasing success? Less stress, less vulnerability equates to increased success. And when we talk success, we're talking behaviorally, we're talking emotionally, and most importantly, we're talking academically. I am better able to engage, I'm better able to learn, and you're going to see that over a period of time in my performance in your classroom, in tests, on general testing, etc., which we know is all very, very important to that atmosphere. So what I want to show you guys is a video. It's about 8 minutes long. This video is specific to a high school. A lot of the videos out there for creating trauma-sensitive environments, the videos themselves are focused on elementary settings. There is not one that I have found yet that is in a middle school environment. So instead of giving you elementary age, which is more of that kind of concrete, less abstract, less reasoning, thinking processes, I want to at least provide one that's more focused on adolescence. So this is a high school in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville is currently working really hard to become a trauma-sensitive district, have made a lot of progress and have seen great success in terms of testing as well as behavior and academic success. So I'm going to show you guys this video. Again, it's about 8 minutes long. I want you to take a moment to watch that, and then I will come back to you and we will or I'll talk a little bit more about this. So here we go.
Our school has about 800 kids located on the near north side of Nashville. Our kids are coming from communities that aren't language rich in a lot of ways. So our kids come to us with lots of opportunities for growth, especially when it comes to literacy. We've worked not only to assemble a team of teachers who really understand teaching and learning, but are really able to build those quality relationships and then generate outcomes. I came 5 years ago, and in the 5 years, there's been a lot of change. We teach kids behaviors in the same way we teach them reading and writing.
I really want you to think on who you are, what you represent, things that you're going through.
We started with saying we're going to respect every single kid. So we don't yell at kids. I will never yell at my staff. I will not yell at a student. And if they are yelling at us, we're going to teach them that that's not okay. There it is. And so starting to really change the way we think about interacting with others.
They keep reminding us you're greater than what you think. We keep our heads up. We come in, do what we have to do so we can be that school that no one thought we could be.
But then from there, you have to really build systems. We have 5 core values. They are in every hallway and in every classroom. So they see it all the time and they hear it all the time. We also have non-negotiables that are really specific.
All right, you guys know what's expected of you today, correct? Kids are not swearing, they're not on their phones, they're respecting the teachers.
There's a common language. The expectations in my classroom look exactly the same way as in another classroom. So there's no confusion, and it creates more time for valuable instruction.
We took a model of looking at peer feedback and how we could really support each other. We all kind of come together. We're looking at classroom behavior, classroom culture. Looking at those core values, we can kind of check off what's being adhered to or broken.
You watched hands go like this.
And then we talk about what we've seen. When we look at the core values, a lot of what we saw was evidence of others first.
People feel safe when they know what to expect. And so when you're consistent, room to room, hallway to hallway, academy to academy, kids feel safe within that structure and are quicker to learn. There's a lot of other things that we do to create spaces that are conducive for social emotional learning.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the Zone.
We have a place called the Zone, which we use in lieu of suspension.
This space is created to have a conversation about navigating those issues.
Kids get into a circle and they discuss sort of what their behaviors were and ways to correct it. We have another space where our counselor is located.
All right, so you go talk first, and when you get done, you go talk, okay?
Who does real-time conflict resolution.
I didn't want to tell you who to hang with.
We can't expect people to just get along. We have to show them what getting along looks like.
Yeah, both strong young men.
Some is knowing how I contributed to the conflict, right? And how to respond to you with empathy.
I wasn't solving it out the right way, so I should have communicated better.
We have a space that we call My Space that feels a lot like a student union. We use it both for reward, but it's also open at lunch where kids can play and be with kids.
It's over, I'm winning.
And so when you design spaces for them to interact in healthy, positive ways, they interact in healthy and positive ways.
What we're going to look at today is a very quick article that really answers the question, why do we encourage ourselves to breathe? Why have we concentrated so much on it, and why is it so hard sometimes?
Rachel Hunt, one of our exceptional educators here, has worked dominantly with our kids that have some sort of learning disability related to behavior.
New research published in the journal Science suggests that you heed the advice.
All right, so what's the first thing we do when we read that article and we're annotating? We do a literacy standard every day. Okay, so you weren't aware of what the word heed meant, right? But we teach social emotional learning through that literacy. So, who wants to read our first paragraph for us?
Regular breathing.
We are reading a brief article on the science behind how breathing actually impacts our bodies and our minds. They will analyze the text, so they'll annotate. We do a lot of discussion. And then we also do an activity connected to the article. Who in here was stressed the last 2 weeks? You can actually communicate to your body, I'm all right, man, it's cool. by changing the way you breathe. So we are going to do some actual mindful breathing. We practiced breathing and really thought about what the breathing made us feel. Breathe naturally.
I was getting in trouble, getting suspended. But, this semester I had a big turnaround, getting better grades. Because meditation, it helped me, release all that anger and all that out of my body. Yeah, so that made me change.
She has said, these practices are great, not just for my kids, but us as a school.
We're going to begin just with 2 minutes of mindfulness.
The Nest is our daily advisory. We divided it into 2 chunks. Half the time is that social emotional learning piece, and then the second part is spent reading a novel together.
We are going to dig back into this book. We want to broaden kids' capacity to enjoy reading by having deep conversations about the subjects and themes that kids live out. So in the middle of page 100, you've got this cop who represents this abuse of authority, and you had a reaction to that.
People abuse their authority when they get it. This boy, he got beat up by a police officer. When I heard that, I instantly, it just draw me into it because that's something I see, I go through every day.
A lot of this stuff is actually happening.
Right, there's a lot of police brutality going on.
The Nest lays the ground for academic learning. It holds kids to higher standards and to higher expectations.
In this book,
it's a time to build community. Make certain every kid has at least one individual in the building that invests personally in his or her best.
Our Nest is a family.
Somos familia.
I feel like I could talk about anything I need to in here.
We have huge accomplishments around outcomes. Our discipline is going down, our learning is going up, our kids are coming to school more, they feel more connected. All of that is indicative of the things that we're successful in.
We get to recognize the outstanding accomplishments of 18 of our seniors who are going to be signing full academic scholarships today.
Looking at the data, they've grown in learning. But far more than that, they have become people who are increasingly more aware of who they are and care for others.
We're so proud of you.
All of that is directly linked to social emotional learning and to some of the outcomes that we want.
Okay, so when we look at a video along that line, really the purpose of this video is not for you guys to go out and be like, okay, I got to do what the video says. Ultimately, I really want to ignite a conversation amongst you and your peers. What is it that we could do differently? What is it that's going really well? Because there's many things in Goodrich that are going really, really well. You have a great administrative staff. You have a great teaching staff. You have a great para support. What is it that we're already doing that's working really well? But having those conversations to say what could be better, what could be different, what areas are we seeing the struggle in most, and how could that look different? So ultimately, in that video, it kind of ended with looking at some of their statistics and being able to see that, yes, there is a possible for success. Now, with that said, I don't expect that you're going to see it overnight. Don't expect that if I put this in today, that 6 days from now, all of a sudden my classroom is going to look completely different. It takes time. The Nashville schools, this has been a 3-year project that they've been working on. And this past year is the first time they were actually able to see evidence of increased outcomes around testing, increased outcomes around behavior management, less suspensions, less out of classroom time, and just overall higher assessment scores in multiple areas. So it won't happen overnight, but it can occur. Again, the link for that is provided right here. It's on the Edutopia website, which has a lot of great videos around creating those trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive schools. So just as a reminder, these were the 3 specific areas that we looked at in the fall and that we kind of talked about. Transitions to learning, minimizing some of those vulnerabilities, and then just compassion fatigue in general. When we talked about transitions, I specifically kind of talked about that, they should be consistent and structured. One of the things that you heard in that video was that every single classroom was doing the exact same thing. Everybody knew what the expectations were, including, that these are the things that are okay, these are the things that are non-negotiable. So I think of with your BIST programming that you have in place, is every teacher utilizing that the exact same way? For the PBIS concepts that you have begun to integrate, is everybody doing the same things the exact same way? It's important because that consistency creates safety, decreases that vulnerability. Same thing with transitions. Transitions do not have to be exactly the same in every classroom, I'm going to say that. But every classroom should have them, whatever those may look like, so that students know that when I walk in, especially during those high vulnerability times, every student knows that I'm going to have this opportunity to bring my brain space back to a calm place, to be ready to learn. So these transition times are when students are most vulnerable. Coming in the morning, to and from lunch, to and from your classes that are less structured. So that's like your gym time or PE, your art classes, music classes. Not that those teachers do anything differently, but the subject nature itself tends to need less structure in place. Doesn't mean that they don't have it. It's just a different subject. Going from an art class back into an academic learning environment is a huge transition. We need to be sure that we're providing the supervision that they want in all areas of the school. And again, not every class has to have an in-class 2-minute transition that this is exactly what it's going to look like, but does have to have a transition of some sort. Something that's put in place. And I will tell you right now that you have to be able to read your students, and checking in with your students at the door can tell you a whole lot. And there are many teachers in your school that are already doing this. Good morning, good afternoon, it's good to see you, how are you today? All while the students are coming in from wherever they were at into that classroom. So a lot of you are already doing that last piece, and I really want to encourage you guys to keep it up on that. Those that aren't, maybe consider how you could begin to do some of that. Transitions should be consistent in structure, allow for some sort of calming activity. That video talked a lot about kind of that mindfulness aspect. Any mindfulness activities that are out there can be done in 1 minute or less. Not asking you to take 30 minutes to do an entire yoga class or 30 minutes to do an entire meditation. 1 to 2 minutes just to bring that brain back to a calming place. If you identify students, they're just not ready to learn in this moment. Get them up, get them moving, have them engage in an activity of some sort, and being aware of that dysregulation. Number one intervention for dysregulation, number one intervention for managing that stress is movement. And that can even be calming movement. It does not have to be running and playing basketball and walking and those things. It can be stretching and moving and breathing, etc. So then we have transitions to leaving. And a lot of that is more so, students are watching that clock, and 2 minutes before that bell rings, they're already getting antsy and revved up. Great opportunity to take a minute or two, bring them back down to a place, remind them of the expectations, non-negotiables. These are the things that I need you to do, and then send them out the way. So send them out the door. As they are leaving that door, we want to always make sure they know they're welcome back. So making sure that we're giving that message. Those teachers that are still using call-outs, I see this a lot more in the 6th grade classrooms than I do or 7th or 8th. Just a reminder that I had encouraged you to add maybe a physical component and maybe a small countdown to the end of that. It takes this verbal call-out from being 10 seconds to 30 seconds, but you're going to go from getting 25% of your students on task to 98%. That 20 seconds is well worth it. The second one that we looked at was then that vulnerability piece. It's kind of what fuels some of that behavior. Vulnerability is number one on that list. What really fuels it and fuels that vulnerability is how people respond to me. If I don't have that relationship, if there's that lack of genuineness. So really more efforts that we put up front are ultimately going to lead to needing less of those efforts later on. And so, how do we address this? And this is where I had asked you guys to kind of go against human instinct and really look at things from giving kids that opportunity to neutralize or to calm, reestablishing the relationship, and then taking the time to really address the issue. And part of that addressing and readdressing the relationship is taking that time to understand, coming back to that healing begins the moment a voice is heard. And that can't be a more powerful statement than when we're talking about adolescence. I am going to be less vulnerable when you take the opportunity to do that. The less vulnerable I am, the more capable I am of taking responsibility and accountability. And that's what we're getting down to. I need to hold you accountable. I need you to be responsible for your behavior. We have things in place that things are okay, things are not okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to harm others. And we really have to get that message through. And we do that by having them be in a place where they have the ability to take responsibility and accountability. To get there, I have to have a brain that's functioning, and I have to have a relationship established. The last piece then that we talked about in the fall was just that compassion fatigue. We talked quite a bit about how fatigue and frustration can impact your decisions. So really what I want to emphasize is this last little piece right here. What are you doing to take care of yourself? It's April. We're almost there. You have a few weeks left of school. My guess is for some of you, your stress level is at its max right now. You're tired, you're fatigued. This is the time that it's most important to be taking care of yourself. Finding something within the week that's about you, that's relaxing, that's calming, that can bring your brain space to a place where it needs to be, even for just a moment. Next year, as you go into the school year and you're starting to do your planning and you're in the midst of that, maybe talking with your team members or your peers or your administration and really identifying, how do we do this differently next year? Can we? What is going well? What's not going well? How can we ensure that come February, March, April, May of next year, we're not at the same stress point that we are right now? How can we do things differently? So really, ultimately, the goal of this whole process, it really comes down to one thing, and that's a conversation and a discussion. As you guys are planning for next year and you're looking at the students who are most in need, and you're looking at who can be there for us, what do we need to do, which students are struggling the most, really bring into those conversations the things I've talked about today. How do I change things in my classroom if I need to? How do I add things to my classroom if I need to? And the most important piece is, if you're going to make those changes, do it at the beginning of the year. Because then students walk in knowing and learning the expectation from day one. And then it's not a surprise halfway through the year. Really want to encourage you, my final thoughts on any of this. You guys are an absolutely amazing school. You've got some great systems in place, some great staff in place. And really you have some phenomenal students. You also have some really tough students who are just as phenomenal, but cause more stress. How can we manage those things in our environments? And we can do some of that by just putting some of these basic things in place. My final thought for you, it's not hand-holding. It's supporting. It's creating an environment for the students of today. And I think that's the big piece. If some of you are like, we just need to go back old school doesn't work anymore, because the students you have are so much different. And so really want to encourage you, start those discussions, have those discussions. I want to thank you for allowing me this time to chat with you. And I wish you guys the best of luck with next year. Thanks so much. Take care.